Hi, my name is Chad. The claim that I'm going to be responding to is that violent video games have little to do in contributing to youth violence. And my opponent's secondary claims are, the first one, that violent video games are not negatively affecting the crime rates in youth. The second's going to be video games help manage anger and relieve stress that cause aggression. And the third one is that video games are unrelated to youth gun shootings. So for the first one, I'm going to be saying that violent video games contribute to youth violence, and children who play violent video games may experience an increase in aggressive thoughts, which in turn could boost their aggressive behavior. This comes from a new study conducted in Singapore. In this study, children ages 8 to 17 who played a lot of violent video games showed an increase in aggressive behaviors, such as hitting, shoving, and pushing 3 years later compared to their behavior at the start of the study. And those who decreased the amount of time they spent playing violent video games saw a decrease in aggressive behavior, according to the researchers. That comes from livescience.com. And the reason the increase in aggressive behavior, there was an increase in aggressive behavior, was that children who played a lot of violent video games had an increase in aggressive thoughts. Okay, for the second claim, violent video games actually do contribute to aggression and youth violence. 90% of pediatricians and 67% of parents agreed or strongly agreed that violent video games can increase aggressive behavior among children. And 60% of middle school boys and 40% of middle school girls played at least one mature rated game, accordingly beat or hit or beat up someone, compared to 39% of boys and 14% of girls who did not play M-rated games. And that comes from videogames.procon.org. And in 2007, 32% of students aged 12 to 18 reported being bullied at school, compared to the 5% in 1999. And researchers tend to think that this is due to the violent video games that teach children that violence is an acceptable approach to solving conflicts and achieving the goals. And for the third point, many perpetrators of mass shootings have played violent video games. The teenage shooters in the 1999 Columbine High School massacre of 13 students played violent combat games, and many mass shootings have been carried out by avid video game players. There's actually, this shooting actually contributed to many of the studies, because it was well known that these teenage students played these kind of games, so they wanted to do the studies to make sure to get results to see if that's why that caused that. And James Holmes in the Aurora, Colorado movie theater shooting that you may have heard of in 2012, Jared Lee Laudner in the Arizona shooting, and that killed 6 people in 2011, and Anders Breivik, who killed 77 people in Norway, he actually admitted in 2011 to using the game Modern Warfare 2 for training for what he did in Norway that killed 77 people. And an FBI school shooter threat assessment stated that a student who makes threats of violence should be considered more credible if he or she also spends an inordinate amount of time playing video games with violent games. And that's all. Thank you.
Structurally, everything is easy to follow. On the first point, you've got a clear counterclaim. You talk about the issue of aggression effectively. You've got some good information there. You have a tendency to do post-citation of your evidence, and I think we talked about this on the claim of fact arguments. It's better to do the citation before you give the evidence, so it's a little bit more distinct. On the second point, you've got a lot of statistical information that you're pouring out here. Remind us that the whole argument is really about increasing aggression and seeing relationships between the behavior of people who are game players versus those who refrain from playing those particular games, and that you're drawing an analogy or a kind of a correlation between those activities. The bullying argument, I think, is an interesting one. It ought to be developed a lot more. Sometimes the argument is, look, you don't find a lot of people suggesting that bullying isn't important. The idea that bullying is connected to the video game playing, I think, is an interesting argument. I think it's very vague with the evidence that you've got on this point, and if you had better evidence on that point, that it would probably be even more convincing to people. The fact that all the perpetrators in these crimes committed, play the video games, it's not causality, but I did think that it was interesting that the FBI says the threat's more credible if they are involved in playing those video games. That seems to suggest that the FBI sees it as being a pretty significant relationship. There's not really any discussion of the adequacy of the advocate's argument, either in terms of reasoning or evidence, but you do a nice job presenting some counterclaims on those points. Thank you.